Hello, this is Dr. Benjamin Smith, lecturer in philosophy with Catholic Studies Academy. Welcome to Take Every Thought Captive, where we explore the 2,000-year-old Catholic intellectual tradition. Today, I am joined by Dr. Richard Bulzacchelli, our lecturer in theology, to discuss the Second Vatican Council. This year is the 60th anniversary of the Council, so there's been a lot of discussion, renewed interest, debate, maybe a little bit of controversy, would you say, Dr. Bulzacchelli?
Yeah, a little bit.
A little bit, that's right.
More than a
About the
little
council and the meaning and its legacy, I guess you could say. I know that on the internet, there's been, let's say, a lot of discussion about kind of the meaning of the council, sort of what direction the council should push us in. I know currently we're in a period of the Synod on Synodality, right? Which some, people claim as sort of an essential fruit, right, of the Second Vatican Council. Some people react to that negatively. So there's, like I say, a lot of debate, discussion about this, as well as a lot of people, I think, stepping forward to talk about what they see as the positive fruits, right, of the Second Vatican Council. So we thought today would be a good opportunity. Dr. Bulzacchelli has did a good bit of expertise in this area to sort of just have an open discussion about the meaning of the Second Vatican Council, its relationship to the kind of larger Catholic tradition, right? And what it should mean for us in our own time and going forward. Rich, I know one of the ways that the council is often talked about is in terms of its relationship to the prior teaching, right?
Yeah.
The prior sort of Catholic tradition, especially the Western Catholic tradition, and whether or not it is in continuity or discontinuity with that prior tradition. Correct me if I'm wrong. I believe before he became Pope, when he was still prefect of the CDF, Cardinal Ratzinger at the time, publicly and specifically addressed the Second Vatican Council and current theological debates in those terms. Is that correct?
Yeah. So basically, for much of his career, even before he was really in a position of great power in the church, Ratzinger read the council in terms of this question about continuity versus discontinuity, right? Is it continuity? Is it rupture? And he was of the view that the council was continuous with tradition. And he thought that this, what he called the hermeneutic of continuity, was the only way to really understand the council in a Catholic sense.
Okay.
Hermeneutic of rupture is necessarily un-Catholic.
Okay.
Right. So he would say that it's just an erroneous interpretation of the council, although advocated for by many.
Sure. What does it mean? So, like, what would it mean? What does it mean to say, to interpret the council in continuity with the past? Like, what would be sort of a conceptual or theological sort of example of that?
Well, there are basically two ideas, I think, that work in tandem on this, right?
Okay.
Number one, you would say that the truths previously expressed, but which, coming up against new problems, have not been expressed in ways that directly respond to those new problems, are further developed, right? So that what's contained by implication, right, in previous articulations, is now drawn out, unpacked, made more explicit in response to contemporary situations. That is not to be understood in Hegelian terms, right?
Okay.
That's not a statement that we're just continually developing what we say, so that 50 years down the road, 100 years, 200 years down the road, suddenly we're just completely in the opposite direction of where we were before.
Okay.
But instead to say, I'm saying X, and then and then some new situation that hadn't really crossed anyone's mind at the time we said X has arisen, and somebody says, well, gee, how would that fit into this new situation that no one ever imagined before? Right? Well, you can't find directly in the proposition X the response to that new situation. But what you can do is read that proposition in light of many other things that have been said in the tradition about various other matters.
Okay.
And you can now formulate a response to this new situation. And I think that that's the way Ratzinger understood one dimension of the continuity issue.
Okay.
I think the other dimension of the continuity issue for Ratzinger, and this is like I would say part of his identity as a member of the ressourcement movement, right?
Okay.
Is that there were aspects of Catholic thinking that over time, in the context of their historical circumstances, had sort of been obscured, things that we'd forgotten about, right? And that what happens is, as you go through the centuries, you tend to sort of frame your thought, right, in a certain way. And as you do that, there are certain things you just don't talk about as much, and you start to forget about. But they're there in the tradition, in the fathers of the church, and in say buried in the early medieval tradition. And they're, why not bring them back? Is it wrong to dust them off and reintroduce them and say, hey, have you seen Sam? You haven't seen Sam for a while. Bring him back into the room and let people talk to Sam again. I don't. I think that's part of what he's thinking, right? I think that's part of his thought. So look at the two main movements at the time that Ratzinger was involved in. Ressourcement, which goes back to really the late 19th, early 20th century, right? This desire to recover not only sort of collations of the sayings of the fathers, or quotes, right, taken out of context of the fathers in the writings of certain great theologians, most especially St. Thomas, but to go back to the actual texts, right? And this was made really much more, it was a much more possible thing for us to do by the early 20th century, because so much work had been done in recovering manuscripts, right? Ancient manuscripts. They'd been collated. We were starting to work on scholarly editions of them and put them into contemporary print, and we could publish them and make them widely available. So think of all the work done under Ming, right, with the Patrologia series. All of a sudden, it's possible for us to read the fathers in a way that wasn't possible even like for St. Thomas, right? So the ressourcement was really about that, going back and recovering the tradition. Not just one snippet of it, one line of the tradition, right? One trajectory, but
the broader.
So but the other movement, though, other movement is the aggiornamento movement.
Okay.
All right, which that's the one I think that probably raises more consternation among a certain segment of traditionalists, right? The aggiornamento movement is the movement to bring teaching in the church up to date. And I would say here's where in my view, the problem with the aggiornamento movement lies. I believe in the aggiornamento movement, but the problem historically is not everyone involved in the aggiornamento movement was really committed to ressourcement. And I'm sorry, but if you're not committed to ressourcement and you're in the aggiornamento movement, you're probably going to turn into some kind of Hegelian.
Yeah, I can see that, because you're not rooted in something. You're sort of wanting to do this updating project, but you don't sort of have a sort of standard
Yeah, you don't have a
behind
commitment.
you, right? To kind of provide at least an orientation, right?
Yeah.
That will be sort of faithful to the tradition.
Right. So Ratzinger's view,
Mm.
I think, right, is that Vatican II is aggiornamento in continuity through ressourcement.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right. I think that's his reading of it. And I would say
Mhm.
that's also true of John Paul II.
Okay, good. Yeah, that's helpful. The So what would be an example, Rich, of something in the council that's an effect of the good sort of aggiornamento plus ressourcement that you're referring to?
Yeah, okay. So going back to Vatican I, all right, which I've been reading more about lately too, you know. Vatican I was a very messy council, and one which it's interesting, you know. Many of the criticisms people would level against Vatican II could just as easily be leveled against Vatican I, in terms of the politicking and not everything seeming to be on the up and up, right, as the council's unfolding. Different factions, some of them modernist, at work behind the scenes, and some of those factions were sort of moderate, others extreme.
Mm-hmm.
That was true at Vatican I, just as it was at Vatican II. And one of the criticisms that was leveled,
Probably true at Constantinople III as well.
Yeah, I think pretty much
the Byzantine
virtually all the
emperors didn't get really involved in a lot of this stuff. But anyway, it's good.
Virtually all the councils, right? I mean, this is just, councils are not, it's, you know, that saying, if you don't you don't want to see how the sausage is made.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah.
So Vatican II had its definite problems. I mean, Vatican I had its definite problems. The central issue at Vatican I was essentially responding to the contemporary socio-political situation in the late 1800s, right? So you had what you had at Vatican I was a radical shift in the way states existed, right? So you had a decline in monarchy, and the rise of, you know more about this topic than I do, this era in politics, right? You had the rise of secular governments, right? Secular democratic regimes. And for a long time before Vatican I, the magisterium of the church had been expressing deep concern about the implications of this shift.
Right.
With grave fears about the totalitarian tendencies, right, involved in these kinds of governments, because there's no one particular person you can identify as someone to be held accountable, right?
Right.
And instead, you had this possibility of developing a tyranny of bureaucracy and law. And one of the things that could happen, of course, right, is that, and was being explicitly expressed, was that the authority of the church was pushed away, and the secular authority presented as absolute. So the church wanted to respond to this. And the two documents at Vatican I were really responses to these questions. The first situates what a proclamation of faith really involves. And the second deals with the structure of the magisterium, in particular, the papacy. Right. So the proclamation of Vatican I about the immediate and universal primacy of the Pope, right? The immediate, ordinary, and universal primacy of the Pope throughout the entire church and over every individual in the church, was sort of a bold assertion that placed our articulation of the papacy in language that was arguably by some a rupture from tradition.
Mm.
And because it emphasized to a kind of extreme, right, the role of the Pope in the church.
Sure.
And then finally, the claim that the Pope could utter statements infallibly without requiring the consent of the church to do so was also considered a rupture from tradition by many people. And what we don't tend to talk about in Catholic circles is the number of people and how widespread were those at the council who were very unhappy with that proclamation and advised against it. All right, so the First Vatican Council was really messy, and I want to say, what were they worried about? Right. Well, they were worried. They were worried that basically we were now teaching ultramontanism when before we'd always considered it a heresy.
Okay, you're talking about the critics of
Vatican I,
of papal infallibility,
right? The critics of papal infallibility and absolute universal primacy, right? They were saying, I thought yesterday we said ultramontanism was a heresy,
right? Sure.
Now we're teaching it in our documents. So it turns out that following Vatican I, immediately the ultramontanist reading of the documents came to the fore.
Sure.
And now the church had to be faced with suppressing the heresy of ultramontanism, which it did. But the problem is that the way the documents are worded, they do lend themselves to such an interpretation.
So this is, I think, actually an important point because, right, you mentioned Hegel a few minutes ago. One of Hegel's, I think, good insights, right, is that there is such a thing, right, as zeitgeist. That there is a spirit of the age, so to speak, culturally, historically, right? Like there's a public mind, sort of, right, that goes beyond any individual or any individual's intentions, right? And sort of takes on a life of its own sort of trajectory, right? I think that's probably true of Vatican I and what you're talking about, as well as Vatican II, or really any, I mean, Hegel would say any sort of historical period, right? There's a spirit of the age that sort of, as I say, has a life of its own and a trajectory of its own. And maybe the ideas go beyond, you sort of, I think about sort of the moderate revolutionaries in the French in the French Revolution, right? Who sort of, were kind of businessmen and kind of merchants, and were sort of like, well, we want less noble privilege and tradition to restrict our business, and then things get really out of hand, right? You're like, oh, I didn't mean all that, right? But the ideas do have this kind of logic, right, kind of built into it that sometimes kind of runs away from the original authors. But
right. So your question was about Vatican II,
correct?
And here I'm talking about Vatican I. Why? Because one of the things that became really obscured in Vatican I as a result of Vatican I was exactly what role the bishops played in the church.
Yeah, right.
So, I mean, there's no question that became a major problem. And we developed this view of the church in the wake of Vatican I that was extraordinarily top-heavy.
You could, right? I mean, if you took that definition very literally, right? This is absurd. I don't think anybody intended it this way, right? But if you took it literally, it seems to me you could logically just get rid of all the other bishops.
Right. Well,
or maybe like three of them or something like that, right? You might need three to elect the next pope or something.
Right.
But basically you could just have, papal delegates or, whatever, scattered throughout the world to be kind of managers. And that's all you really need.
That's basically right. So Otto von Bismarck, who is no friend of the Catholic Church, right? In fact, he was part of the problem. He was one of the precipitating issues. So he immediately, was like, well, I mean, it was exactly as they predicted, as the critics predicted at the council, right? How Catholics would be thought of. So the Pope could just tell you, it's snowing on the 4th of July, and it's snowing on the 4th of July. He could say whatever he wants. It's true. And the bishops here are nothing but agents of a foreign potentate, right? That's all they are.
Yeah, sure.
They're middle management guys,
Find
and
that, yeah.
their
Yeah.
sole purpose is to repeat what the Pope says.
You can find that in WASP propaganda in North America all
Uh-huh.
over the place, right?
Yeah,
Especially right after that came
in
out.
the
It's
school
like,
books.
oh yeah, I mean, like you can see Uncle Sam. One of my favorite pictures, like cartoons like this, is Uncle Sam, sort of like standing on the North American continent, right? And he's kind of sort of standing up in this upright, he's just like no, right? There's just like this cringing kind of Pope figure over
Yeah.
inside, trying to invade, right, the
Uh-huh.
United States, right? Because it's a foreign potentate, right?
Yeah. Right. And many of the American bishops, I think the majority of them actually were
Mm-hmm.
opposed
Mm-hmm.
to the proclamation, right? To this
Mm-hmm.
definition for that reason.
Right. So how did Vatican II kind of help that situation?
Yeah. Well, Vatican II helped the situation because it placed more emphasis, right? It kind of filled in that gap that was left
Mm-hmm.
after Vatican I. Clearly, in my view, it wasn't enough, because I think we still deal with the problem,
Okay.
right? But um, but if you look at the documents, if you look at Lumen Gentium,
Mm-hmm.
the document on the church, right, the
Mm-hmm.
constitution on the dogmatic constitution on the church, you do see a renewed emphasis on the importance of the bishop, right, the authority of the bishop in the church, and
Mm-hmm.
his and the cooperative relationship, right, that exists between the Pope and the bishops, that the church
Sure.
isn't just the Pope.
Sure. Yeah. I think that's a so we're talking about collegiality, right?
Yeah.
So the heading it usually falls under.
So it's definitely a recovery of something that was
Mm-hmm.
absolutely in the tradition,
Mm-hmm.
right? I mean, just try to think about this for a second.
Mm-hmm.
The Catholic tradition, without like understanding who the bishops are,
Mm-hmm. Doesn't make a lot
that's
of
a
sense.
bizarre thing.
Yeah.
And yet there's no question that in the wake of the First Vatican Council, there was tremendous confusion introduced into the church over
Sure.
that matter.
Sure.
And
Yeah.
and that issue was addressed
Mm-hmm.
rightly at the Second Vatican Council. It was a
Mm-hmm.
major problem,
Mm-hmm.
and the Second Vatican Council took measures to correct it.
So if you want to think about this positively and constructively, one way you might think about it is that what Vatican I did secure, right, is that we're not going to let nation states reduce the local Catholic churches to merely national churches.
Right.
There's going to be an international global component built into Catholic ecclesiology and jurisdiction,
Yeah.
such that there is this. Just think about it. So, from a political view, there is like you can't just say there's the Church of England, the Church of France, the Church of Mexico, right? That's under the local government, right? So maybe that's Vatican I's positive contribution, right? And then Vatican II's positive contribution say, and yet we do want to recognize, right, that the localities, right, your local church, even maybe sort of groupings of local churches under the nation, that those are realities, and those are realities that have their own integrity to them, right?
Yeah, right. That's right. And in fact, where do I live out my Catholicism? Do I live out my Catholicism in Rome?
Right,
No, I live out my Catholicism in my local parish, in a particular diocese.
Yeah, that's very important. I think so. Yeah. Okay, good. Well, I think that's a good illustration. I mean, I would maybe add just a couple of my own, and then we can maybe talk about sort of the way this is kind of sussed out in terms of different interpretations. So we're saying this would be a good example of continuity, right?
Yeah.
Collegiality,
and it's the kind of continuity that is that's a continuity really that relies on ressourcement.
Okay, gotcha. Right. The two others that I would add in here maybe would be the universal call to holiness, right? Which clearly is in the tradition. It's in the best of the tradition, but certainly had been obscured, or made just kind of unclear, right? With all the emphasis on maybe the sacredness of the priesthood and holy orders and things like that. I don't think with the intention to demean the lay state, but nevertheless, maybe, just sort of losing sight of it, right? In a way. And that the universal call to holiness, again, present, in the earlier tradition, but maybe not.
Yeah, and never gone. I want to be clear on that, right? It was never completely suppressed,
right,
in the church, but it was obscured. It wasn't the way people tended to think about things.
That's
But
right.
in fact, to put it like, let's look at the language people used. Do you have a vocation meant, are you called to be a priest or religious?
That's right. That's right. Or you're just not, well, you're out of vocation. Maybe you just, muck around and get married, right?
Right. You don't have a
Again,
vocation.
not that serious people would thought about that way. But I mean, I think at a cultural, practical level, sometimes it's lived out that way. One other one probably would be De Verbum and the recovery of scripture as a
Yeah.
normal part of Catholic life. Obviously, it would be false to say that Catholics were forbidden prior to Vatican II from reading scripture or participate. But you can also say, at a practical level, right, it just wasn't a major part of normal Catholic life, right?
Yeah.
I mean, maybe the monks chanted it,
Yeah.
but that's not the, most of us aren't monks, right?
Well, interestingly,
that kind of thing. Too.
I could reach behind me here and pull off the shelf some old Catholic Bibles.
Mm-hmm.
I could show you in the beginning of the Bible, right, where they
Mm-hmm.
printed out some statements from popes, old popes,
Sure.
telling the lay people to read scripture on a regular basis, right?
Right.
So that was part of the thing, but in practice, right, it just didn't trickle down
Mm-hmm.
to the people very well. And okay, let me bolster your view. I don't want to pursue this right now, but
Sure.
I want to bolster your view by saying that one of the reforms that was called for in liturgy, which I personally think is a good reform, was the expansion of the lectionary to include more of the Old Testament. So if you're not reading the scriptures at home, partly because you're afraid you don't know how to interpret it, and if when you go to mass, you're only hearing a very small selection of readings, and maybe they're only read in Latin.
Sure.
Right. Where's your Bible?
Right.
Okay.
Right. Doesn't play a large role. Yeah. So those just two I just thought I'd throw in there without doing a detailed analysis. I just think that those are two other ones where you could say that there's, continuity, right? There are things in the tradition that are prior, but you do have some developments, right? That are positive within the council. Now, that sort of emphasizes the hermeneutic of continuity, right? Sort of approach, right? But we know, of course, that that's rejected by two other sort of groupings within the church. And I'm going to go ahead and, I don't mind, just kind of speak to this in using a little bit of political language, just because I think it's useful. I know some people don't like that, but I think it's actually useful here. We could talk about here, right, a progressive sort of faction, right? I think we can talk about a conservative faction and a traditionalist faction. I'll explain what I mean by that. I don't necessarily mean what we would, in using those terms, what we would mean by it in, say, in American politics, but just sort of as a sort of formal ideas. Progressives tend to be sort of people who are for radical change, right? In political language, right? There is a faction within the Catholic Church today that is for radical change, right?
Yeah.
There's a faction in the church that's for some changes, but not radical ones, and wants to conserve elements of the prior tradition, right? And develop them. That's what I mean by conservative, right?
Yeah.
So I would include under conservative John Paul II and Benedict XVI. They're not reactionaries, right? They're not wanting to say no change, right? Or no development. But they're wanting to have some change, but in continuity with the past. And that seems to be conservative in a small c sense. And then we have, I think, traditionalists who, again, without trying to be demeaning or anything, just my interpretation of them is they just say no. Like, these changes introduced by the Second Vatican Council or post Second Vatican Council were misguided, inappropriate, unwise, and we just need to go back, right, to 1962, at least as a kind of a new starting ground, right? Some might want to say we just want to stay there, but whatever. I don't want to get too down in the weeds there. But I think that's a fair sort of analysis, right, of breakdown of the three sort of factions there. That sound right?
Yeah, I think that's about right. I mean, we could probably add some more.
Sure.
There probably are like reversionists, right, who might want to go back to, before Vatican I and stuff.
Before Vatican I, that's right. That's right. Yeah.
But but yeah, I think that's about right. I mean, those are the major players, I think, in this current controversy.
Right. So if you think about it in those terms, right, we can sort of think about we can look at those three factions in terms of continuity and discontinuity, right?
Yeah.
Right. So that with our, one thing that it's interesting, right? Progressives and traditionalists, right, would actually agree on something, which would seem strange because progressives and traditionalists seem to be very opposed. So, for example, on something like interconfessional communion, right? Yeah. Traditionalists and progressives would be very opposed to that, right?
Right.
Like in terms of that, progressives would be very likely to say, yeah, we should have that in some way. Traditionalists very likely to say never should happen, right? That is admitting, say, Lutherans or Anglicans or, whatever, to Baptist to communion. But what they do agree on, right, that is traditionalists and progressives, is that the Second Vatican Council was a rupture, right?
Yeah.
With the prior tradition. Is that correct?
I would say so. Yeah, that is a point of agreement. They agree on basically two things on this, right? Number one, Vatican II is a rupture from prior tradition. Mm-hmm. Number two, they agree that the progressives won.
Right. Yeah. Right.
They agree that the progressives are that they won the day on that. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So the progressives, of course, would be very happy with their own interpretation of the council, and the traditionalists would be deeply discontented with it, right?
Sure. And I think it's important, like if you're not a traditionalist, to kind of understand like this point, because I think it explains some of the I'll say ardor that you might find in the traditionalist camp. I mean, they fundamentally see they see to different degrees, of course, right? But that there's something fundamentally wrong, right, with what's been introduced either by the Second Vatican Council or the subsequent, sort of magisterium or the subsequent sort of church politics, if we just want to put it that way. They're troubled, right? They think there's been a departure, right?
Yeah.
From the Holy Catholic faith, right?
Right.
And that they have to sort of oppose that. People should be familiar with some of the flashpoints there. What would be some of the things a particular traditionalist would tend to sort of criticize, Rich?
Yeah, well, one of the biggest ones is ecumenical and interreligious dialogue, between which I would want to distinguish, by the way. Sure. I want to be clear on that. They are not the same thing.
Right.
And there actually is a whole, that's a very messy subject, right? Ecumenical and interdisciplinary or interreligious dialogue. It's very messy because you've also got the place of Jews and Muslims, and how those should be. Where do we fit those in, right? In terms of those breakdowns, the church has approached discussion with non-Catholic religious groups differently since the Second Vatican Council, and in line with conciliar documents. Right. It has approached those matters differently than it had in the past. And the question is, does that represent a rupture, or does it represent an aggiornamento of the tradition?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I think we can make arguments. I think we can make arguments for both of those interpretations, right? That'll be one case. Right? That's probably one of the really big ones.
Sure.
Another would be people cite the reform of the liturgy, but I don't really recognize that one myself because I don't see that as a conciliar matter. I know, Dr. Bulzacchelli, what are you saying? Well, because when you read the document, on the liturgy, right? Sacrosanctum Concilium, it doesn't contain any of the
Mhm.
any directive to do any of the things that we actually did in the wake of the council.
Sure.
Um,
Does that kind
so
of
I
does
just,
that just kind of kick the can down
yeah,
the because you could say, okay, fine, but then subsequent things did, right? And here we
yeah.
are, right? So yeah, maybe it wasn't Vatican II in itself, but it was the post Vatican II
Well,
regime.
it's the zeitgeist, right?
I mean, somebody signed off on it, or somebody said you can do this stuff, or somebody decided to not punish people for not doing or for. I mean,
Yeah,
at
yeah.
some point, like it's here, and
No, that's true. That's true. And you
uh,
can blame the council for that because the council gave rise to the event.
yeah,
But
sort of
but the
indirectly or something.
document itself
Mhm.
does not
Sure.
call for that.
Yeah.
I'm not,
Fair
in
enough.
other words, so I'm not laying this on the council, the things that went wrong with liturgy,
Mhm.
because I don't believe that the majority of the council fathers
Sure.
signing that document
Right.
had that in mind.
Mhm.
Okay.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah.
Um, in fact, I did a video on
That's right. Yeah.
I did a video on this at one point, right?
Mhm.
And I talked about the John the 23rd's attitude toward Latin, right?
Mhm.
Which was hardcore by from our
Sure.
standards today.
Right. Right.
He expected people to be fluent in Latin in order to get anywhere in higher education.
Of
Um,
course.
so I mean, to think that he imagined the liturgy being just completely translated into the vernacular and
Mhm.
Latin in the liturgy being verboten
Mhm.
is unthinkable. I'm sorry,
Right.
but you can't
Right.
put that on
On
John's.
him. Yeah. Yeah. That's good. So if we think then those are some examples of say what animates sort of the traditionalist view that Vatican II is a rupture, right? You think about the progressives, well, they think it's a rupture, but in a positive way, right?
Yeah,
Like so what would I know that so you disagree with the progressive interpretation of the Second Vatican Council, but sort of laying aside your disagreement just temporarily,
uh,
what would their view, what's the progressive interpretation of Vatican II? Do you see what
yeah.
I'm
Okay,
asking there?
so they see the reform of the liturgy as being sort of a central issue,
Mm-hmm.
right? And for them, right, the the move toward versus populum in the Latin rite,
Mm-hmm.
right, that is turning toward the people when the priest faces the people to say
Sure.
the liturgy. For most of the progressives, I would say that's sort of a non-negotiable triumph, and they're not willing to let that go,
Okay.
even though the documents don't call for it,
Mm-hmm.
and at least not the documents of the council, right? They
Mm-hmm.
don't call for that. The Because they're reconceptualizing what the liturgy actually means, and for them, right, they want to turn the liturgy into an event of the celebrating community.
Mm-hmm.
It's about the community, right? It's really
Right.
about the community. It's about immanence. It's much more horizontal.
Gotcha.
The emphasis
Okay.
is taken off the notion of sacrifice, off the
Mm-hmm.
notion of a an eschatological culmination at the end of time,
Mm-hmm.
right? But instead placed on the here and now, you and me.
Okay. Gotcha. Gotcha.
Okay. So the
Uh-huh.
Eucharist is a meal
Mm-hmm.
rather than a sacrifice.
Mm-hmm.
Now, here's the thing. This is what's insidious about this whole thing. On the one hand, I would concede that some of what they wish to emphasize is indeed found in the tradition of the church.
Mm-hmm.
But I would say that what they've done is they've placed the emphasis so heavily in that direction that they've
Sure.
radically distorted the tradition.
Mm-hmm.
So it might have been one thing to recover elements
Mm-hmm.
of what it was they thought was lost.
Mm-hmm.
It's another thing to jettison all those other matters, right, that had
Right.
constituted our reception of the liturgy in the Latin
Sure.
rite.
Sure.
And
Sure.
it's hard not to say that they did that.
Yeah. Let me yeah, that makes sense. And that dovetails with something else I've heard. And you can give me your analysis of this, but that a lot of progressives see Gaudium et Spes as the central document of the council, right?
Yeah.
They believe that the Gaudium et Spes introduces a kind of a hermeneutic for approaching modernity
Yeah.
that's dynamic. And I'll just leave it at that, because it dynamic and, as you said, imminent, right?
Yeah.
Right. That the way of the church is the way of man, or something like that.
Yeah.
Along
Yeah.
those
Yeah. Yeah.
lines, right?
Yeah.
So, can you address that?
Yeah. 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 So that you might say, right? I think that's another area where progressives and traditionalists agree.
Okay.
All right, that Vatican II is extraordinarily anthropocentric,
Okay.
and anthropocentric in a way that is exclusive from theocentricity. All right.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Now, this is very interesting, right? Because even many of the conservatives will concede that there's an anthropocentricity
Mm-hmm.
to Gaudium et Spes.
Okay.
John Paul II being one of them. He
Mm-hmm.
very explicitly discusses that in Dives in Misericordia in 1980.
Okay.
Now, he doesn't think that's bad.
Mm-hmm.
He also rejects the view held by both the traditionalists and the progressives that means it's exclusive to being theocentric.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so he's threading the needle on that, and I think that's one of the issues that maybe distinguishes the conservatives from both the trads and the progressives, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Characterized by JP2. You could argue about whether he's right or wrong on it, but his attitude is
Sure, I guess
that an appropriately understood anthropocentrism
mm-hmm.
is in fact theocentric.
Right.
Why?
Right.
Not because God is man, but because humanity is made in the image of God and directed to God. Mm-hmm. Right? So if we properly understood what God was up to in making humanity, then mm-hmm. understanding humanity would mean directing our attention toward God. That's mm-hmm. John Paul II's view.
Sure.
But the progressives seem to think, right, that the overlay of God is just sort of almost really an impediment to peace on earth. Because what we're doing is we're putting this preferred religious perspective. We're adding another problem to the mix. It's bad enough that we have struggles over territory and access to water and food, distribution of wealth. Now, on top of all of that, we also have to fight about religion. Mm-hmm. Well, if we just framed our religious perspective as a pursuit of what's common to humanity.
I see.
Right. The common human dignity, human flourishing, mm-hmm. then it wouldn't get in the way, right? Mm-hmm. It could embrace and it could gather in and bring about peace on earth. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's a kind of Marxist way of thinking about mm-hmm. religion, really. But
Sure. Well, I mean, I think you can see liberation theology, right? I mean, it's
absolutely
its development runs closely parallel to kind of a progressive interpretation, right, of these matters, for sure. Okay, well, that's I think interesting and helpful. What if we were going to look at sort of what is it that the conservatives and the traditionalists would agree on vis-a-vis the Second Vatican? Maybe not. They don't agree on. Maybe that's their main point. Is that their main point of disagreement
between the conservatives and the traditionalists?
Yeah. Is the council itself, because it seems like they do agree on certain things. Like I think both traditionalists and conservatives would broadly say reject any sort of changes in moral theology, right? That are particularly known about today or discussed
for
today.
the most part. I think actually maybe, often conservatives see themselves as being in agreement with traditionalists, but not vice versa. I think that's often the case.
Gotcha.
Like, for example, in the Diamond-Castman debate, right? One of the things that came up there was
Do
the
you want
question.
a little context for that? What is the
The Diamond-Castman debate? It's been going around the internet, right?
Okay. This was
In
on Matt
Pints with
Fred.
Aquinas, they had a
Pints with Aquinas,
debate
yeah.
about whether about sedevacantism, right? Is the chair of Peter currently empty, and has it been for a while?
Right.
And Diamond, who is basically a Feeneyite, right? Held a view that the chair of Peter has been vacant since after Pius XII. That's his position.
Ooh, okay.
And it's interesting that Castman had asked him about certain papal proclamations, and he asked him about Humanae Vitae, right? Paul VI's statement Humanae Vitae, and Castman clearly expected him to say that everything in Humanae Vitae is right, but Diamond actually didn't hold that view. Now, to be fair, I mean, Diamond is a traditionalist that's way to the right of the Society of St. Pius X.
Right. Yeah. Right.
But and he's in a legitimately, like, completely schismatic group.
Right. Group. Yeah.
But in any case, right, he does manifest an extreme sort of an extreme traditionalism here.
Right.
And he saw as a departure from tradition. I would understand the arguments that he would make to he didn't get into it, but I would understand the arguments he would make here. He sees it as a departure from tradition, that it's morally licit, as stated in Humanae Vitae, deliberately to make use of the infecund periods in the marital act.
I've heard that
so as to avoid pregnancy. All right. He sees that as a departure from tradition, but most conservative Catholics, right, would say that that's not a departure, that's a development. That's right, that's aggiornamento,
right.
That's aggiornamento from ressourcement, is what a conservative.
I think, I do think we'd have to sort of say, as you did note, right, that that's a pretty extreme traditionalist view. Most traditionalists,
it's an extreme traditionalist view.
I mean, it's pretty when SSPX is all of a sudden the centrist.
Then you. No, I know. Yeah, that's true. That's true. But I only say that to mention that. I mean, even people formally in communion with the Catholic Church, there are some that I've spoken to who would be in the traditionalist camp, who do not agree with conservatives who think that they agree with them.
Okay.
Follow what I'm saying? On a variety of issues. But for the most part, I think it's safe to say it's a safe bet.
Okay.
That when it comes to, as you mentioned, right, how we think about morality, how we think about the absolute unicity of Christ for salvation. All right. The necessity of the sacraments for salvation. There's generally broad agreement on these things. I think we do tend to engage in disagreements around the edges of those discussions.
Sure.
But those are around the edges that, at least as far as, well, I mean, in this camp, I belong to the center on this. All right. I'm a JP2 Benedict XVI conservative. And so, when I look at those kinds of questions around the edges, I interpret them as having been considered open questions in the church.
I see.
That the dogmatic assertions that we make about the necessity of the sacraments for salvation were not intended to address those fringe questions, right? But only the questions in the center.
Sure.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. Well, so got just a couple more questions. We've gone, it's a little bit long here, but there's a couple of things I think we can still need to kind of bring forward. And I think a really important question then would be, how is it that, or at least I see, right, that there's some actual agreement between progressives and conservatives right, on this point, right, that the council was good. Right, right. That the council introduced something good and desirable into the life of the church, right?
Yeah.
Now, again, conservatives and what that good is, right?
Yeah.
Okay, that's going to be where the dispute is. Conservatives are going to think it's something that's in continuity with the past. Progressives seem to think it's something that's not in continuity with the past, right?
Right.
To your mind, could you maybe articulate, this is putting a lot of work on you, sorry, Rich, but what is the conservative view of the positive contribution of Vatican II? Like, what's the conservative view of the good of the Second Vatican Council?
Yeah, so that is a good question.
We spent all this time sort of arguing about its
Yeah.
continuity and discontinuity, and you're like, did it fail? Did it not fail? Is it problematic or not? What's the good of it? Like, what does it give us? That's praiseworthy.
What I'm going to say here may seem both shocking and disappointing.
Okay.
I think that what has generally been said by conservatives about what was good about the Second Vatican Council was that it provided a framework within which to reintroduce Christianity as an evangelical project to the modern world.
Okay.
Right. That even the Catholic mind, keep in mind, right? Even the Catholic mind is influenced by modernity. And so there's a risk that traditional ways of casting teaching will no longer reach the contemporary mind.
Mm-hmm.
Not that those teachings are false, but that they're no longer understood by within the framework of the contemporary mind, right? They're no longer comprehensible. And so the Second Vatican Council sort of forced the church to kind of reframe how we talk about these things and put everything on the table and just shed the light of modernity on it and say, well, what does this look like? And how can we show it to the modern world?
Okay.
That project is maybe laudable. And I would say that John Paul II probably thought that was what the council gave us. Benedict XVI, I think, thought that's what the council gave us. Did the council give it to us? The evidence mounts that the answer may be no. And the problem is when we actually look, I'll throw the Society of St. Pius X a bone here. Okay. When we actually look at the fruits of the council, right? What actually did happen to the church in the years following the council? It's hard to argue that the developments were positive.
Right.
All right. We have a crisis of faith. I did a video on that a while back too. There's a crisis of belief, huh? There's no question about that. And there's a crisis of church attendance, right? There's a crisis of participation. All the things that the council thought would get better on account of what they brought did not get better.
It's gone in the opposite direction.
You went in the opposite direction. So that's just a fact, right? That's not my indictment of the council.
Sure. I'm
just wondering, did the council actually succeed? Did it do what it was trying to do?
Right.
I kind of think it was trying to do that. It was trying to answer these problems, and the evidence calls into question whether it was successful or not. Now, would we be in the situation we're in right now had the council never happened? I don't think we can answer that question. Society of St. Pius X would probably say, no, we wouldn't be in the situation. But I don't know if we can answer that question.
It's counterfactual, right? Interesting. Okay. So would you say that you think that maybe it hasn't gone as well as hoped?
It hasn't gone as well as hoped.
Right.
I think because when you think about the Second Vatican Council, when you think of the church before and the church after, right? Your general experience of the post-conciliar church is what happens in your parish at Sunday Mass. most of the time, right?
Right.
And Benedict XVI was outspoken about his concern that the liturgy had gone awry.
Right.
That things were, what you experience on Sunday at Mass is not as edifying as we would hope, right? It doesn't seem to be getting the job done, I'm sorry to say. Now, I want to say to the audience here that I'm personally not intrinsically opposed to, I'm not in principle opposed to the Novus Ordo.
Sure.
But the execution of the Novus Ordo, without getting into arguments about whether the Novus Ordo is such that it has to be executed that way, I don't think it does. I've experienced devout Novus Ordo masses. Sure. But in actual practice, right, your experience of the Novus Ordo liturgy is something that would appear very foreign to Catholics of 1962.
Yes. Yeah, sure. So you would you say that, so just despite some shortfallings, that there still is in the Second Vatican Council kind of communio school, maybe tools, resources for successful evangelization and sort of renewal?
I do believe that. Okay. I do believe that personally. I mean, I think that the project of John Paul II would say that the approach to thought in the Second Vatican Council was a shift towards something personalistic. And I'm sort of inclined in the communio direction myself, and I tend to think personalism is good. There are different ways to approach personalism, just as there are any other philosophical approach, right?
Sure.
But I think personalism is good. I think it does, in my view, provide a framework in which it is possible to bridge the gap between those who start by affirming your premises and those who don't. Because it's based in sort of a phenomenological starting point, right? In other words, like we can talk about the experience that we have of living in the world, and on that basis, we could begin to discover truths, without me having to get you to concede to certain presuppositions in order for me to make an argument, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I understand. Yeah.
I think that's a good thing that we find in the council.
Gotcha.
But I guess I'm of the view that that John Paul II was more or less of the view. The council hasn't really been implemented well. I know there are people who reject that view. It sounds to them like you're supporting another communist regime because you say communism has never been tried.
Sure.
But I know that's what it sounds like. But the difference is we only have one church, and we've had many communist states. There's a lot more evidence to go on.
Sure. So what would you say is the progressive view of the good of the council?
Oh, the rupture.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, the progressive view is that we finally beat those pesky traditionalists, and we got away from Latin. I mean, look, actually, this is in my view, one of the failings, one of the reasons the Second Vatican Council failed to achieve its results, in my view, is that the council fathers who were in the conservative camp did not correctly assess the philosophical condition of the time. All right. What I mean by that is they were still concerned with addressing modernism. And there were those, right, who thought anti-modernism is still the way forward. And then there were those who thought, no, we need a different approach to addressing modernity. But the real problem wasn't modernity, it wasn't modernism, it was postmodernism by the time you got to the Second Vatican Council.
1960s, yeah.
Yeah, by the time we got to 1960s, we were in the postmodernist period.
Yeah, certainly you've got a sort of new left at that point, right? And I think, within that new left, you have, Herbert Marcuse, you have, the Parisian student riots, you have, opposition to the Vietnam War. We have, this is the time of the liberation movements, right? And kind of a neo-Marxist sort of setting, and perhaps a misreading of those movements, or a miscalculation, right, of their maybe both power and radicalness. If I was to state it from a political philosophy perspective, maybe what I hear from progressives, Catholic progressives, is that basically we've transformed into a situation in which the individual and various communities are liberated, right, from stifling oppressive structures within the church, and are able to kind of live out sort of their freedom in Christ and in the church and with the Holy Spirit, but in a way that is self-expressed, right? In a way that's not subject to oppressive hierarchies, right? So it's more spontaneous, it's more autonomous, it's more personal, right? And that we're all on our own journey. We're a community in the sense that we're all on this journey, right? But not in the sense of kind of ruled by a sacred hierarchy with one faith, right? That sort of thing.
Right, which is
I'm not trying to distort here. I really am not. If I've said anything
no, I think that is kind of their view,
right,
with the exception that the hierarchs wish to stay in power. The hierarchs promote that view.
Right. Well, that kind of works though with that kind of works with a neo-Marxist polity, right? Because even in a neo-Marxist polity, you still need the Politburo, and you still need various officials and commissars and so forth.
But really, I think you're right that basically they want it's Unitarianism.
Okay.
And right. If you could log onto the Unitarian Universalist website and you'll see right there, right, that they profess a common covenant, but not a common creed.
Nice.
And I like that's what they say.
Good. Yeah, I got you.
But when you look at say the German Bishops' Conference, one is led to think, right? I don't think my interpretation here is on the fringes when I say it seems like that's what they think.
Sure. Yeah. Well, that's this has been a lot to think about. I think a lot of good insights here. What would you? I have a hypothesis I want to kind of close with, but before I offer that, what would your counsel, your thought, be for Catholics out there, trying to navigate these issues, as far as sort of going forward, both in their parish lives, but maybe also in terms of their understanding of where they are in the church.
Yeah. The virtue of fortitude, I think, this is one of those times in the life of the church where we need it, coupled with, of course, the theological virtue of hope. And because the condition of the church right now is not good. I think it's hard not to see that the church is in a crisis at this moment.
Right.
Again, just look at the numbers, look at the statistics, right?
Yeah.
We're clearly in a crisis. And yet I don't want to say something trite like, we've been through this before, look at Council of Nicaea. That's not much help, to be honest, when this is the chapter of the book that you're living in. Right. But I just want to say, fortitude and hope. and trust in the Holy Spirit that ultimately things will be worked out. That whatever trough we may happen to be in,
Right.
there will be sort of a period of resurrection.
Gotcha. Would you be willing to give us sort of your thought about where things are headed in the next couple of decades?
Next couple of decades, I
So,
would say
through the end of Francis, into the next kind of.
I don't know. I mean, I will say that at this moment, it's hard for me to imagine that we will escape a fairly major schism in the church. Who's going to initiate it? It's hard to say.
That's interesting. Because the one group it seems to be least likely to initiate it. Well, that's really hard to say. But it seems that the group least likely to initiate it would be conservatives. But maybe I'm wrong. I don't know.
Yeah. So the conservatives are the mentality of the conservative, right? Because it's a mentality of continuity. Is, I think you're right, least likely to be the group to initiate a schism. Because they don't see every change as a departure.
Right.
And they also see the value of remaining tied to what's there, right? But I think the progressives, if you look at, say, look at the German synodal path, okay? I just don't see any possible outcome for that movement that does not end in schism. It either stops and rejects itself, or it ends in schism. That's my diagnosis. I could be wrong, but that's what it looks like to me.
Gotcha. Well, that is not exactly an optimistic future, but I mean, I guess sometimes we just have to look at things as they really are.
Yeah, I don't. What happens after that? I don't know. Right?
Gotcha.
I can't. I can't say that I know. But you could sort of imagine, though, that in the life of the church, if the German bishops went into schism en masse, that would change the composition of the Council of Cardinals if that happened before the next conclave. And then who knows who the next pope would be.
Gotcha.
And the thing is, look, you could be surprised, right?
Sure.
You never really know what's going to happen. I don't think people. It seemed that Benedict XVI had stacked the deck in favor of a subsequent pope who would be a lot like him. And I think we got a pope who was not a lot like him.
Interesting. Yeah.
And many people now, right, think that Francis has stacked the deck in such a way that we're guaranteed a pope a lot like him. But if past his prologue, that may not be true.
Right. Gotcha. Well, that's helpful, Dr. Bulzacchelli. I hope that our audience here has been able to kind of take all this in. I think we cover a lot of ground, but I think it kind of in a pretty systematic way. I think to kind of see where the various sort of divisions lie and why those divisions are there and where there's similarities and where there are differences. And I think I hope we've drawn that taxonomy out in a fair and accurate way. One hypothesis that I just want to close with, and I've kind of I'm not personally a theologian, but I pay close attention to these matters, and kind of from a philosopher's perspective, especially somebody like myself who's interested in the history of philosophy and the history of ideas. One thing that I've wondered about is whether or not modernity, that maybe the problem that we're facing now isn't so much a problem with the Second Vatican Council in itself, but the problem might be that modernity cannot be enculturated in a Christian way, which would be a fairly harsh thing to say, right? But I am aware of, as a historian of thought, that Catholic thought has gone through various stages of synthesis. right? If you look at it, right, one way of thinking about it, right, is that you have is that very early the Christian thought engages with Greek thought, right? And that in that early stage, Stoic and Neoplatonic sources were very important, right? In later stages, Aristotelian sources became more important, right? You could kind of sort of track sort of a trajectory that way. Over time, Aristotelian philosophy began to lose its influence in our own culture, in the Western culture. And then what, right? Well, then we have modern philosophy, right? And its advent. And it seems to me to be an open question. And when I was teaching full time as a professor at a small Catholic liberal arts college, one of the things that some of the students I'd be closer to over time would ask me is like, well, how do you think this is all going to suss out? And I would say, well, I don't know. I don't pretend to know. But I still think it's an open question whether or not is it possible, put it precisely, for Catholic thought, Catholic faith to form a new and fruitful synthesis with modern thought, as it did in the past with Greek thought in various forms. And I think that remains an open question, actually. I think that it might be that we just, at least it's possible that it's just not something that we can form a new enduring synthesis. Modern thought. What do you think about that, Rich?
Yeah, my initial thought is first noting that we should have a podcast on that.
Good
question. My initial thought is that in any case in which the church has formed a synthesis with some pre-existing current of thought, that current of thought has been transformed in the process.
Sure.
Right. So there are things about it that had to be corrected.
Sure.
And so I would say that if indeed it's the case that we could form a synthesis with modernity, it would have to be one that would transform modernity in certain essential ways, because there are indeed elements of modernity that are antithetical to the faith. Right. The anti-modernists weren't wrong, okay, about certain basic critiques of modernity.
Yeah.
But I think when you see John Paul II is actually engaged in a project that had been going on for a long time before he showed up, right? The movement of personalism within Judaism and Christianity, which traces back to really the early 20th century, is itself a response to Kant. Right. When you think about it, what they're trying to do is find a way around Kant back to a world that's real. And whether you think they can do that or not, I guess is another question, right? But what they're doing is they're trying to acknowledge what Kant and modernity get right, but not to come to the same conclusions.
Right. Yeah.
That's what they're trying to do. So
Sure.
Whether they can or cannot do it is really a big question, huh?
Sure. Yeah. I think I agree with you. That'd be a fun and useful, I think, discussion for another podcast to kind of run through some of those possibilities and see maybe what that would look like and maybe whether it's possible or not. You would certainly hope that it's possible, right? And I think that your point is well taken, that when Christian thought synthesizes with something else, it changes the thing that it synthesizes with. I think that's a fair point of interpretation, and probably a good launching point for that discussion.
Yeah, so the question would be, does it change it so fundamentally that it's no longer recognizable as it was before, right?
Right. Yeah.
Would it destroy the thing that it touches?
That's right. Well, this has been a great, I think, a great topic, a good discussion. I hope that our listeners have enjoyed it as much as I have and gotten as much out of it. I hope that we all, sort of persevere as Dr. Bulzacchelli has counseled us, and continue and hope that things are the things that the church has been through hard times before, and that we will get through this as we have in the past. I hope that everyone will like this video, share it with others. Check out all of our other great content at CatholicStudiesAcademy.com. We have courses there that are available for purchase if you're interested in studying more theology and philosophy. And then until next time, God bless.